right, so as he mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the human factors in encryption and privacy. So the human factors of security and privacy is really just the unification of two general fields inside of computer science. So human-computer interactions, the study of people, and then the study of how security and privacy technologies work. This sign is a beautiful example of why this is necessary. It doesn't matter how strong that lock is. I'm pretty certain the sign's going to win. And this really kind of explains the general problem we have inside of security. People account for a very, very large percentage of our issues. This report calculated as much as 90%, cutting across several of these different points. What's almost the most interesting about this report actually was this quote. So the quote goes, at this point, at the point of reading this 90%, you should take your finger, put it on your chest, and repeat, I am the problem, as long as it takes for you to believe it. Good. That means that you've taken the first step to recovery is admitting the problem. This is a fascinating quote because it actually covers the security community beautifully at the moment. They know they have a problem. They don't have their heads in the sand. They fully understand that the part of the issue is the way people are interacting with their technologies. They get that, and they understand that it's important to be involved in it. However, typically unintentionally, their first reaction is, why can't the people use this stuff? What's wrong with the people? Can we get some better ones? It'd be lovely. So one of the founding papers in my field is this one, which is Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. And so what they did was they took 12 Carnegie Mellon computer scientists, so 12 computer science, roughly PhD students from one of the top programs in the country, really the world, and tried to get them to encrypt an email. This was really bad. They didn't. 4 of them managed to actually encrypt this thing within a 90-minute session. Having tried this with undergrads, I'm actually impressed they got all 4. And we saw tons of really, really dangerous type errors. So things where people were sending emails and not realizing that they weren't encrypted, things where they were sending the wrong types of keys, things where, all the sorts of things that if you were actually in a really dangerous situation would expose all the things you're trying to protect. And so this was kind of a seminal paper because it highlighted this point that we have some really intelligent people here. People are very good at computer science. Getting better humans isn't really going to work. We need to start thinking a little bit more about how we're designing these technologies and think about how people are going to use them. So the unifying topic amongst all 3 of us today is encryption. Security is a big area, but encryption seems to be the thing that's kind of in the news at the moment and we're focusing on here. And so what I'm going to be talking about is why we don't actually see widespread adoption of encryption technologies. Now, I know the governments will tell you it's going dark and it's terrible, but it's actually surprising the amount of encryption we're not seeing out there in the general population. I imagine most of this audience has probably never encrypted an email. And I'm pretty rare in the security group in that I actually encrypt them fairly regularly with only a small number of people who are willing to put up with this. This could be much bigger, and it's not. And so we're going to kind of talk about why. So I work a lot in usability, and so I think about encryption frequently less about the math and more about how it's used. So what kind of properties do people expect? How do they interact with them? So typically we think about encryption in terms of 2 properties when we're talking about from a usability perspective. One of them is communication. So I want to encrypt communication. I want to make sure that the information, when I share it with whoever I'm talking to, it's not being leaked out and no one's adding information in, so that it's a secure communication. The second point is that I really care that I'm talking to who I think I'm talking to. It's because if I have the first property and not the second one, then I could quite happily be sharing it with concerning groups. Let me do an example of this using traditional Alice and Bob descriptions, which is how we always describe this in security. So Alice wants to talk to Bob, and she wants to share secrets or send information. If we look at just property 1, she could just set up a secure communication, so she could encrypt this. We know a lot of technologies on how to do this right now, and we don't actually really need a person involved in it in the slightest. involved in just setting up just the encryption in terms of securing the communication. Things like Diffie-Hellman, there's a lot of ways to do this. The problem is that a really smart attacker without the second property will just do this. So what happens is Alice goes and says, oh, I want to talk to Bob. Eve is sitting in the middle, and so she goes, oh, it's okay, I'll take that encryption connection in here, talk to me. And then she relays messages on to Bob. And then what happens is it looks to Alice and Bob like they're talking. So Alice says something, Bob responds the way she would expect him to respond, and yet at the same time, everything is going through this middle point of Eve. And this is a problem if we can't determine who we're talking to, because if we don't know who we're talking to, then we don't know if we're talking through something in the middle. This is traditionally referred to as a man-in-the-middle attack. I got a good question from a student the other day. It's like, well, how often does this actually ever happen to anyone? I mean, you look like kind of the paranoid person up in the front of the room presenting this. This happens to you a lot. It happens to every person in this room, and I'm pretty sure it's probably even happened to most people in this room within the last 2 weeks. Let me give you an example. Alice goes to her favorite coffee shop and tries to visit BBC News. She expects to see this. She actually gets that. This is a man-in-the-middle attack. They're not necessarily breaking encryption to do this in any way. It looks kind of like this. Alice didn't necessarily encrypt something, but she tried to access something. The point in the middle said, no, I don't want you accessing that, and sent her something else. This is an attack you see continuously. This isn't typically an attack per se, because it's a benign situation in many ways. The group is informing you that they have done it, but they don't have to, and nothing's stopping them. I think one of the more brief heart attacks I had once was I went to a hotel and I looked at my own webpage and it was covered in ads. And I was trying to figure out who'd broken into it, and I realized they hadn't broken into the webpage. The hotel was just helpfully adding advertisements to all of my connections going out across the thing. This happens to you more often than you realize. And here's a particularly interesting example. So this is a homework assignment I sent out with students. It's literally a cookie cutter homework assignment in that we are making cookies using the assignment and putting them, and the student literally just changes the content of the cookie. So every single student should be turning in what's on the top. You'll notice the thing on the bottom has a lot of extra stuff in it. This student actually got man in the middle while they tried to upload their own homework. What gets even more interesting is that this student thought that they would add a VPN to the situation and that would make it safer. The VPN's what is man in the middling them, if you actually break this down. This stuff happens, and it is a real problem. So how do you protect against this? Well, the traditional way we do this is we add encryption into the situation. If you want to go and add encryption to a channel, typically online, you add this S in which you're asking the system to go and do HTTPS. This is an example for ally.com. Ally is a bank. Annoyingly, Ally will only set up encryption on their homepage if you ask them to. So you can log in either of these two ways. There's a big difference between these two identical looking images. The one on the right is actually from Ally and has a full connection between the two of us. And how I know it's actually from Ally is something I'm going to explain in 2 or 3 slides, in which I get back to that second point. The one on the left could have anything in it, because it could have been man in the middle. Those buttons could have been switched out. It doesn't matter that it actually looks identical. It could have been changed, and because of that, it could have been used to do an attack. It could even be used to do this sort of clickjacking type attack, where all that happens is I click on it, someone else shows me an ad briefly, and then sends me to the actual web page, which might be benign, but again, is causing trouble. All right, so I'm just flashing this slide up here again to remind you. When we're doing encryption back and forth between 2 computers, we know how to automatically set that up. That's pretty much saved. Our big problem is actually sitting in the second one, so knowing who you're communicating with. And we do know how to solve this. There's a lot of cryptography work on how to solve this. The problem is almost all of it requires a person. Typically, we think of this in terms of public-private key cryptography. There are other solutions, but this is one of the most popular. This is my public key. It just is an example of how long and interesting these things can look. Broadly speaking, public-private key cryptography works by creating a pair of keys where if you have the public one, you can always tell whether or not you're talking to someone who owns the private one. So the idea is that you give the public one out as widely as you can. You put it on slides, you put it on your homepage, you give it out to people. And then whoever has it can verify whether or not they are talking to someone who has the private key, which you're not supposed to ever give out. And so therefore, since only one person has it, you can start making this sort of assumption about, oh, I know now who I'm talking to. That sounds really simple, but it's a chicken and egg problem. Because if you go to my webpage, and you don't know it's my web page, and you use that to download the key, and then you use the key that you don't know where you quite got it from to verify that you're actually talking to me, we now have a problem. Chicken and egg problem. The way we're supposed to fix this is by taking these keys, lining them up on pieces of paper, making certain both people have the exact same key, and then everything works. But people don't quite work that way. There's been some research on how to do this a little bit easier with humans. The short version is we can make it better, but we cannot make it easy. And so this doesn't scale. And so because the internet needs this to work, we instead go and do this thing called certificate authority. So someone had this brilliant idea. Well, you know, expecting every single user to go and compare these keys to each other for every single possible combination of someone they might talk to is kind of crazy. Maybe we should go and have a couple people who we trust to make these judgment calls, and then we just all trust them. So inside of web browsers, you have these things, like what it's kind of pointing at here, in which someone else attests that this person is who they say they are. They're making a statement about this key. And inside the web browser, there's a list of people who are allowed to make these sort of statements. Entrust is the example here. Google's another one that's inside of it. VeriSign would be another example. This is a very long list, actually, of people that can make these sort of statements. But if any of them makes a statement that this website is who it says it is, your browser will believe it. And this is broadly how we solve the problem. The issue is that this doesn't always work. So this is the superfish attack that hit, or not attack, feature of IBM, or of Lenovo laptops. That hit the news a little while ago. Lenovo was shipping a key of the type, a certificate authority statement inside of the laptops that said that you should always trust for every single website out there. Every single one of them is owned by this thing called Superfish. And so Superfish can make the statement that I am this web page for any website on the entire internet, and you should believe them. This was used to interject ads into Lenovo machines, or let's see if I can remember the Lenovo sentence. It was to determine what things you were viewing so that you could get ads that you're more likely to appreciate through the system. Unfortunately, it wasn't set up very well, so it also allowed anyone else to make a statement and claim to be Superfish and then claim to be anyone they wanted on the internet. So this does break. It also breaks with other groups. So GoGo, that thing that tries to charge you money so you can have internet on airplanes, also pulls this trick. In this case, though, it would have theoretically created a warning. Unfortunately, we know from a lot of literature in usable security that warnings are something that users avoid and click through. I'll get to how bad in a moment, but what's actually happening here is similarly GoGo wants to prevent people from viewing things that have a lot of traffic on airplanes, like YouTube. And so they're, again, man in the middle in the connection, which was not noticed by anyone until a Google security researcher happened to be flying and noticed that this little tiny user interface thing up in the corner was not what it was supposed to be, and then sent out this tweet and caused this huge hullabaloo about it. So one of the things we like to know, so I said that warnings are something we sometimes try. So when we figure out that something is not quite what it should be, and we're not certain if that's okay or not, we tend to toss it at the user and go, well, is this okay or not? And that's partially rational, because the user is the only person who knows where it is they think they're going. The computer can't make that judgment call. And because, unfortunately, a lot of businesses frequently don't necessarily have the right certificates or encryption. And because of that, we do sometimes need to move past these things. So there was a study done by Google Research, looking at the click-through rates, the number of times some of these warnings show up, and then on Firefox and Chrome, how often a user completely ignores the warning and goes and does the thing anyway. What we're really interested in is the HTTPS one down at the bottom, in which Firefox has 33% and Chrome has 70%. Chrome was understandably concerned about this, and so they went to try to figure out why. And one of the interesting things they found is that users were ignoring warnings for sites they had visited in the past. So sites where they had been there before, and now there was a warning when there wasn't a warning before. Now this can happen for a lot of reasons. This could happen because there's actually a man-in-the-middle attack. This can frequently happen because the site has been infected. It could happen because the site is now serving up an advertisement that's infected. We might be going to a section of the web page we weren't going to before. But whatever it is, the user has been there before, and therefore they've decided that they are not trusting the system. And so this is just some quotes from participants that they interviewed during this study. So YouTube is a well-known website. I'd assume that malware block is in error. I mean, why would YouTube have this problem? I find it harder to believe the warning when my Facebook friend just posted it and had no problems. I presume that visiting YouTube from Facebook link would be safe, so they're making the assumption that Facebook is scanning these things. Facebook is scanning these things, by the way, but that doesn't actually solve the problem, because a lot of the things check to see whether or not it's Facebook that's loading the web page, and then make a decision on what they're going to show in content. So a lot of things vanish if it's Facebook or Google or one of these large companies scanning. I use Linux. I'm not afraid of anything. I have an antivirus. So people, even if we can detect and find these things, it can be very challenging to get people to follow through and actually pay attention to some of the things we're pointing out. And this is the sort of things we frequently study in this field. All right, so let's shift a little bit. We talk about end users, and we complain about end users a lot, but developers are a really fascinating set of end users, especially around now. I'm informed by the news that anyone can code. It tells me this frequently, and usually in large type. Obama apparently has learned to code. I once heard a security researcher refer to this as the most terrifying thing to happen to security in a long time. And it also is an enormous problem from a general security perspective, because it means we now have to treat developers as end users. And so you saw the way we were treating end users a moment ago. We don't treat developers any better. If anything, we treat them a little worse. So I want you to kind of think about what all the end developers are building on your stuff, particularly the sorts of things that are developed by one or two end users. So the work I just showed was sitting on web browsers. So web browsers, a lot of effort has gone behind security. They can afford teams of security professionals. They're working on essentially one code base that a lot of people are checking and fixing and working on, and we still find stuff in the news periodically. These apps are constructed by one or two people. They don't have anything they can properly sit on top of that just does the encryption for them. And so each one of them has to kind of implement it on their own. And that can cause some fun. So this is what I'm certain will soon be a seminal paper in this field, entitled The Most Dangerous Code in the World, Validating SSL Certificates in Non-Browser Software. So what you're looking at is about 3 lines of code out of PHP. It's using something called libcurl. This was identified as causing a phenomenal number of security problems. This code actually disables SSL verification, proper SSL verification. So it enables the first one I talked about, but not the second. It turns off the ability to determine who you're talking to. This is a serious trick question, because I put this up in front of students all the time, and they're like, I have no idea. It's a little subtle. So that's the line. This is the problem. There's a word true at the end. In computer science, true can mean true, false, or it could also mean 0, 1. This particular thing wants a number, not a true, false, so it's going to helpfully convert it to a 1. Ones, in this particular context, mean off. It should actually be a 2. This confuses the heck out of most developers. They just don't get why this could be a problem. The person apparently that constructed this API contacted the author of this particular paper and commented that no one else had complained in the last 9 years, and he couldn't really understand why this particular person had an issue with it. But this is the type of security problems that are causing really big problems out in the internet today. This line of code, while it looks so trivial, was sitting on really big services, things like Amazon Web Services, where it was wrong, bank apps, where it was wrong. And if bank apps are not testing these things, it does not get better when you start looking at the sort of things that interact with your Fitbit, or that monitor your blood pressure, or that are tracking your weight, or that are doing any of these other sorts of things with the data that you really care about. And so this is a fun problem. So other researchers have gone out and tried to figure out how this happens. So that was a really nasty problem, but there's a lot of other much simpler ones that we also observe app developers making errors with. So the novice example here is pretty typical. This app was one of our first mobile apps, and when we noticed that there were problems with the SSL certificate, we just implemented the first working solution we found on the internet. A lot of students I know take this approach. Intermediate student, we used a self-signed certificate for testing, which means they use something that does not verify who you're talking to properly. It's just not the right type of certificate to use, but it's cheaper to construct. And the easiest way to make them work is to remove the certificate validation. Because if you don't remove the certificate validation, it throws up errors all the time because it's saying you're not talking to who you think you're talking to. So they just took that bit out and forgot to remove the code before production. And then it gets a little bit more exciting. So we have expert developers. So Wireshark is an application you can use to look at all the traffic coming in and out of your system. Real encryption is really hard to properly validate. Just looking to see whether something looks kind of garbled is not a good way to determine whether you've actually done encryption properly. But that's what's going on here. So they said, okay, well, I was suspicious. I wanted to make sure this was actually properly encrypting. So what I did was I just pulled open all the packets going past and looked to see if they look garbled. And then this is actually in response to the researchers pointing out that there is a massive flaw in his system. He says, I really don't see what the problem is here. It's working. And all of these sorts of things kind of come together in this general problem we think of as usable security, and why it is we're not necessarily seeing the level of encryption we would like to see penetrated into the devices and systems we use. It's really hard to do these things like managing the keys for an end user, and so we don't see adoption as much inside of things like email. Even when we do see adoption in things like the web browsers, it's got a little bit of fragile in how it's done in places and still problematic. China, for example, has a certificate authority. Software libraries are also not usable. We're starting to see a greater influx of novice developers, and we're not necessarily treating them as end users, and that's causing a lot of side effects, because even if you do everything perfect as an end user, if the developer is not following through, you still have a massive problem. And so this is a huge area that we're looking at and we're trying to address. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any burning questions that they'd like to ask at the moment? Okay, do we have the box? Or we can just use this?
What was the problem in that last slide? The one where the developer said, I don't see what the problem is.
Oh, the problem, I don't remember exactly what happened there, but they had, so you can set up the encryption, and then if you're not verifying where it comes from, then the encryption is proper, but it could be encrypted from anywhere. And so there could have been a man-in-the-middle attack, and it would have looked identical to what he was talking about. It would still have looked the same, because he's dealing only with the first property and not the second.
Type attack and stuff like that. But from what I've sort of read recently, one of the biggest issues is not encryption, but actually what is happening as an end user when you decrypt things. So, and everybody kind of swap things from there. So, you know, all encryption you want to do and certificate you want to do, I just sort of get it when you are actually seeing your screen or typing your keyboard at the end of the game.
Yeah, so I was talking about encryption in transit. So we usually think of data as in transit or at rest. You're talking a little bit at rest in that you're talking about just the end user. You're right, we have an enormous problem like that in that area, and I kind of just called it out of scope so that we could actually have enough time to discuss one topic. I'm happy to spend hours explaining that one to you. The short version is it's really hard securing an end device. There are tricks we can kind of do for high value issues, but for most cases it's just really hard to do. And so we're just trying to, yeah, for the man in the middle, we're just worrying about how it communicates over a different point.
So my psychology as a user, thinking that I'll give up because my computer is already infected with that end user thing, what do I care about these things?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I justify to, I'm one of those guys who sort of clicks through that warning, right?
No, that's okay. So there are a lot of strategies you see from people. I mean, everything from, it's actually impressive how low the infection rates are right now for viruses. I know we talk about viruses a lot, but viruses are actually becoming a much lower problem. Much higher are things like Trojan horses or things where you click on something and invite it in. Microsoft and a lot of other companies have done a lot of work around putting up enormous walls around your system. One of the least nice things about users I think I've kind of heard from Microsoft is this statement that this thing that you found is not a security vulnerability if the user had to click something. So they will not take, they do a bounty program against things. If the user has to click something, it's no longer valid for their bounty program because a user had to invite it in. And at this stage, one of the biggest problems we have is actually users inviting things in or users trying to interact with something that's got a flaw in it, and then the flaw goes on through. So doing basic type protection actually will get you a long distance in individual device protection right now.
Thanks for that overview. I was just wondering, obviously for a satellite to do detecting single photons, it has to be incredibly sensitive. We have a problem in the UK, I'm sure everywhere in the world, of people shining lasers at aeroplanes. If you shined a laser at one of these satellites at the same wavelength it's trying to detect, would you be able to blind it?
Yeah.
And is that an issue?
It is an issue. And it's actually one of the noted issues of quantum communication that it can be vulnerable to what is called a denial of service attack. So shining lasers into the system can be used to either just block it or blind it, but it can also be used even to exploit it actually as well. So there's been some experiments, what was called quantum hacking, where lasers into QKD devices, including the commercial ones, were actually where they were able to implant information just by blinding the detectors in a very careful and clever way. However, these are implementation questions, right? So there is, and I had it at the sort of at the end about the future directions. There's a lot of possibilities of mitigation, such as narrowband systems and better filtering. Also, the spatial mode can be filtered better, as well as the temporal mode. So, so those will obviously have to be directions to be pursued in the future.
Yes, so just to check whether I have this right. So is the community thinking about this as a novel, very secure option, or is this going to be the way that we communicate with everybody in 20, 30 years?
So that I think on the long term, it will be with us. So our information technology will develop, or transcend, so to say, into a quantum realm. What I mean, it's kind of showing up already even for classical systems, right? When they want to increase bandwidth and capacity, their signals get weaker and weaker all the time. And already now they're working, I believe, at a few photons per classical bit, right? So pushing capacity and bandwidth of even our existing optical channels will lead us to a quantum realm or quantum region. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's quantum information, but that I think will then also be a natural step. Now the big question though is really, it's not so much if, it's more like when. So 20, 30 years maybe, but maybe also longer. Or shorter, if something. Okay.
Thanks. I'll now, people ask questions whatever you want to any of the speakers, Thomas, Christopher, or Camille, just let us know. I guess there's a question right here in the front.
Hi, it was great talks. In terms of the quantum entanglement of the information, that you can't actually, if you try to intercept the information between the 2 points, that the other person will know. I mean, really, for all of you, isn't that the worst nightmare for the security services? I mean, is quantum computing going forward something that the security services really don't want implemented?
I know in the case of the NSA, they've begun to discuss that they will start looking at quantum-resistant encryption. My understanding is it's a little bit different in the UK, and there's some dispute as to how GCHQ will take up quantum systems. And in the Canadian environment, CSC has a huge investment in quantum security. Perhaps unsurprisingly, neither the NSA or the other agencies are terribly forthcoming as to the work that they're doing, but it is something on the radar of at least some of the agencies.
Sure, I think I meant, obviously they want to protect themselves, but they wouldn't want the general public to have this same level of protection.
The quantum-resistant algorithms, as I understand them, they're not being suggested or designed for pure government use, and instead they'd be public standards. So that would be publicly propagated with, again, part of the challenge being, what do we trust what they propagate?
I'll add one more piece into that, which is that governments actually are, broadly as I have seen, don't seem to mind that 2 points are encrypted, provided they have access to what happens after it comes off the encryption line. So I mean, you see this in things like Snooper's Charter and other sorts of elements where they don't mind that connection, that the data while it's moving is encrypted. That's not an issue. They just want access to the data at some point. It doesn't have to be in transit. And that is in many ways the way they're trying to walk the line publicly, is that we want to support strong encryption. We do not want things like Scotland's small businesses losing all of their data to China. That's very, very bad. But at the same time, we need access when we give you a warrant or when we say we want it. And so it's wrong to think that these governments aren't necessarily supporting strong encryption. They're just being very precise about where they kind of do and do not want it. And so it's kind of a balance.
There are lots of questions here, so I think maybe Peter I saw. And
just to come back to Thomas quickly, has any thought been given about how gravity wave detection might be affecting communications sometime downstream?
Okay, there's no clear answer. Yes, there has been thought on impact of gravitational effect on quantum entanglement, quantum information, in particular photons. So there's been some proposals about some, if you measure entangled photons at different gravitational potentials, let's say one on the ground, one in space, there might be some decorrelation going on. So in that sense, there is some work on that. There's also relativistic effects, such as from special relativity, just large velocities. When you do the transformations, you couple spin and spatial mode, so there can be effects there. However, and actually we had a large overview paper actually about that, which we worked on with people from Perimeter Institute and beyond, where all of the potential influences of quantum physics, quantum entanglement, and other known physics, there might be little things, but all of those effects are very weak.
Well, so. I was just thinking maybe from a simpler point of view, this isn't my area, but since if you can detect a gravity wave, you must be able to transmit information with it. Is that too simplistic?
So my personal opinion is, because I'm not an expert for gravitational waves, but I would agree, yes, you could communicate with gravitational waves, but maybe if you follow the news, right, the event you need to, the source you need for those gravitational waves is not easy to handle. So.
Yeah.
Okay, there were a lot of questions. Thomas, maybe next, and then Fuyuki.
Right, so it's within the living memory of some of us older folks where there was no internet, and we still somehow managed to communicate in a secure fashion with other individuals in society. And what I noticed was that there was very little discussion about changing user expectations about the degree of security that one should expect to have by broadcasting your information into a network that can be tapped at so many different places. And so I'm wondering if that is something that is also being actively discussed. I think that's more of a question to you, Cami, in some sense about what effort is there going on to have users have better practice from the perspective of expectations? Like, not all information can be important. I mean, there has to be some relative sense of what is important and what is not.
So this is an interesting question from a lot of regards. First off, we've been tracking data from people long before the internet. We're pretty good at it. Letters, for example, are still tracked. The front and back of a paper letter that you send through the United States is photographed, every single one. So it's not just sending them through the mail will not save you. And this has been an ongoing sort of tracking. This is long ago this has been happening. Expectations are really fascinating, particularly when you start talking about the younger generation. Because the younger generation views privacy a little bit closer to some of the, not necessarily boundary management the way you're describing it, but the interpersonal boundary management that we do on a daily basis. When you ask them, you know, what happens if you turn these Facebook controls this way or that way, they kind of look at you and go, why would I do that? Because Facebook's going to change them in 5 minutes anyway. There's no point in twisting that knob. Instead, they speak in doublespeak on these things. They think of ways to phrase something such that it means one thing to their parents and one thing to their friends, because it happens to be a phrase out of a book they know that their friends have read that has a very different meaning than it looks like on surface. One of the things that kind of terrifies me in many ways about the NSA type surveillance and the type of surveillance we see from advertising companies is that they confuse correlation and causation in many regards, and they're not necessarily taking into account many of these behaviors we're seeing around the way people manage their privacy in between different people online. Now, the other fascinating thing is that there's some interesting logic, at least within the United States, regarding expectations of privacy and what you have or have not done to defend your privacy. And I'll let other people discuss the legal implications a little bit better. But there's this weird circular logic that now you know that Snowden told us this thing. Now you know that putting this up there is potentially leaking it. So it's your fault for putting it up there. Did you not learn from this experience? As opposed to previously, you know, we could have said, well, you didn't know, it's not your fault. It's kind of a roundabout answer to your question, and it's a very complicated one. And I think it's one we kind of need to discuss in many ways, because if I do want to communicate with a friend who's frequently now not co-located with me, I need some options, and there really aren't any good ones. And the most traditional method of handling these sorts of problems for human beings is to offload the trust onto some other party. And unfortunately, at the moment, that seems to be Facebook, which is a little concerning, or Google, or one of the other groups. But I'll let other people comment if you want.
Expectations are very hard to manage because people have different expectations of privacy based on group dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, and ultimately what the law says. And so certainly in the realm, the United States is an outlier. So the United States has something called the third-party doctrine, whereby if you share information with a third party, you have a diminished, if any, private or zero privacy expectation, what that happens to be. And in an internet era, that's absolutely absurd, because it means that if you have an internet service provider, if you make a phone call and you're obviously using a phone provider and so on and so forth, there is always a third party involved in the communication, and thus there's a diminished or zero expectation of privacy. Unfortunately, in the Canadian context, Canadians watch a lot of American TV, and so they tend not to understand what the legal context of communications privacy is in this country, which is not like the United States. Simply because it's transited through a third party does not mean you lose all privacy interests. Similarly, if you go, Britain again gets a little bit weird because of its engagements back and forth with Europe more broadly. But the mass surveillance that I was talking about, the European courts have found to be illegal and cannot go on. Mass data retention has been found to be illegal and in violation of human rights and cannot go on. And so part of the difficulty is that everyone in this room will have a different understanding of what privacy is. That's just the way it works, right? It's one of those great fuzzy concepts to throw around that means something different to everyone. And it is where you can go to the courts, and especially the European courts that are backstopped the way that they are in European law, and you can start to say, okay, well, we may disagree on sort of the nuances of intersubjective privacy or something like that, but there are certain practices that are impermissible. And it doesn't matter if it's a tweet, it doesn't matter if it's an innocuous, hey, how's it going, or a very serious communication that you're having. The content of the communication is not always the most important piece, but the mechanism under which access to the communication takes place. And I would just note that in Canada, we had a very important case that went through recently, Spencer at the Supreme Court. And this actually saw the Supreme Court assert that there is a right to anonymity online. And given that Canada follows the common law, that has significant implications throughout other common law countries. So part of it, I think we're seeing the courts finally figuring out what's going on, with the United States being just absolutely offside of almost everything when it comes to both law and normative expectations.
Okay, there was a question over here. Let me toss it this way, and then there was one at the back that I'll get to, hopefully.
Thanks. So Chris, I like the turn towards deliberative democracy and Habermas in your talk, and how this is kind of this intersubjective notion of privacy is very promising. However, the Habermasian framework from a sociological perspective, as opposed to, let's say, a political philosophical perspective, has two central weaknesses, which you're probably familiar with. The first one being, in my opinion, that it overestimates the willingness of ordinary citizens to value and to participate in democracy in a thick way, which is not simply about voting every 4 or 5 years or 3 years, but actually participating in deliberative fora in civil society where they will debate and deliberate around certain issues. So many citizens are more than willing to trade issues of privacy and security for the convenience and expediency of internet communication. We all click on agreements constantly when our software is being updated without reading them, and iTunes and everything else. Secondly, so that's one weakness, and the second weakness has to do with the way in which deliberative democracy requires actual fora, institutions, through which this takes place, which have to be fundamentally civil society institutions, not necessarily governmental ones for all kinds of reasons. And at that level, certainly when we're talking about issues of internet privacy, that's very, very thin. There are groups of experts, such as the group of which you're a part at the University of Toronto, the Citizen Lab, who do this, but in terms of actual fora where ordinary people are participating in these kinds of issues, institutionally there seems to be a great lag. So how, I mean, I'm sure that the folks at your lab have talked about this. How do you or they address those two potential weaknesses?
Yeah, I mean, those are both really fair. And so one of the, obviously there's enough people writing about Habermas that you can choose the scaffold you want to build around them. But one of the things that I've found convincing is that, of course, you do need these formal deliberative mechanisms in order to engage between civil society, politics, and the rest. But much of the discussions that we are engaged in are political. So when you're talking about your friends privately on Facebook or something like that about the NSA or the state of TTC if you live in Toronto or whatever the case happens to be, that functions as political speech. And so it isn't just about ensuring that the formal mechanisms between citizens and legislators, something like that, are protected. So not just about fostering the thick bonds, but ensuring that those the bonds within society themselves are able to foster. And so much of the work that's come out of the United States through survey data has shown that even within small groups, the actions of signals intelligence agencies has taken away from the robustness of those smaller, less formally political communications. And so, through a Habermasian model, if you look at it, structurally or systematically, you need to have that base level of communication amongst the citizenry in order to percolate up. So I think that what I'm as interested in is how do you facilitate or enable deliberation in those soft spaces? And then in terms of how do you actually foster more robust engagement between sort of the citizenry and politics more formally, I think that takes place in a bunch of different ways. You're right to point that there are issues of forums, like how exactly do you get people to formally come together, debate, discuss, and the rest. We're seeing more and more civil society organizations try and take that role on in different ways. So in the Canadian context, it might be a group, say, like Open Media or something like that, that's trying to facilitate a discussion across, their 1.x million Canadians on their mailing lists and things like that. But I think we've also seen efforts by some governments to try and include citizens more directly. So in the Canadian space, we've seen experiments all throughout the federal level in how do we bring citizens formally into the political process, either as individuals, as experts, or as just people who have taken an interest in one way or another. And so Industry Canada's been doing this in a bunch of interesting ways. CRTC has been doing it. And most recently, in discussions that groups of us have had with various federal ministers of the new government, they're trying to explore ways to formally facilitate these kinds of forums around security and privacy issues. So some of it, I think, is government is slow. You can point to different sort of techniques or tactics that have been used around the world to foster this. But I think some of it is you have to have a government that's interested in experimenting and falling on their face, quite frankly. And I think, fortunately, we're at a point where we have a government that wants to consult and wants to fall on its face. And out of that, hopefully, we'll see the less disastrous ways of doing so to facilitate those sort of forums.
I'll jump in for a moment here as well. So at a different level, we have this problem of self-efficacy and cognitive dissonance. It's really hard for me to look at something at the level of this NSA documents and think, how is this actually impacting me? It's not the same thing as a burglar that broke into my home. I feel very intimidated by that. I can see it right here. There is no good way for me to right now see anything of this. And even if we're not talking about the NSA, because the NSA is in many ways sitting at a different level, if we talk about things like advertisers or some of these other groups that are interacting, there is, again, no easy way for me to really see what's going on. And as a citizen, or perhaps as a very American viewpoint, theoretically, the capitalism is supposed to help deal with some of these things, particularly in terms of the Internet of Things, in terms of the use of encryption, in terms of many of these elements. But as someone going into a store to purchase a new object for my Internet of Things or to buy a new TV, I don't necessarily read the privacy policy to discover that I'm not supposed to say anything private in front of it. Which is a reference to Samsung, by the way. Don't say private things in front of Samsung TVs that have voice. It says that in the privacy policy. That is not evident to a consumer. It is not trivial to see, and because it's not trivial to see, you don't see a lot of this grassroots moving up to try to engage in some of these conversations because they just don't, it's really hard to conceptualize it, even as people in this audience. And that's some of the work we're starting to try to do at Edinburgh. So things around like how to actually visualize what's going in and out of your Internet of Things. There's been some beautiful work coming out of Mozilla on things like Lightbeam, where it tries to visualize all the trackers, anything that allows people to really play with their own data and see this is what's happening right now. And I think some of that is desperately needed because otherwise it's just so hard to make the mental jump.
There was a question at the back. I don't know if it's still, I think the questioner might have given up on me. Oh, there she is.
Here.
I was listening.
Excuse me.
Use the bathroom. I was listening well, I'm a Romanian, now British, but I'm coming from a society which was widely surveyed for many tens of years, I suppose, and just emerged from behind the Iron Curtain in '91 before the internet was widespread and available. And I would like to know whether there is enough data out there explaining what's happening in the Eastern European countries in terms of governmental surveillance of data, say in the past 15, 20 years, because the situation in 91 was that we were all on the streets talking about democracy. There was no internet and most certainly no surveillance for quite a while. Then we come in the Western world and we find out that governments that we looked up to are surveying everything and nothing, there is no escape. So we want to know, how does Eastern Europe fare in this overly surveyed society? Are they more democratic from that respect, having been through a process, or are they the same as everyone else?
Technologically, you're asking a very tricky question, which is about attribution.
Which is why.
Because sometimes we get to see so Snowden is very unique, in a couple of the other whistleblowers are unique, because they exposed information from the inside. When we are looking at the situation from the outside, it is incredibly challenging to tell who did what. You might be able to tell that this particular thing was interfered with, or that something was broken into and the information was read out. But determining who done it, really challenging. And so trying to do that level of attribution to actually figure out how much is being tracked by these governments is very difficult. Now, I haven't personally gone through the Snowden documents, so I'm kind of looking to you, Christopher, to kind of answer that bit of the topic.
Question, because you seem to be.
So at the Citizen Lab, we spend an awful lot of time running around the world and going into servers. We don't. We have a strong ethical protocol as to what we can and cannot do. And the other thing we do is generally study information controls around the world. So ways in which governments disrupt communications opportunistically at different times. So we do know that former Soviet states quite often exhibit high levels of information controls. And these take place in a bunch of different ways, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't access a website. Sometimes it does. But it can just as easily mean that during an election, you can't get access to opposition leaders' websites, or you can't get access to polling places, or things of that nature. So there's a recognition of selective takedowns of information. There's also strong efforts by, as an example, both the Russian and Chinese government, but it's true in other areas of those regions as well, where governments will hire citizens and they'll be paid a certain amount of money in order to add pro-government discourse around sensitive events, which is, again, a way of influencing the way that citizens understand what's present. There's a really good book that came out recently called The Red Web, and it details the history, not just of the internet, from the Soviet era to today, but it also explains the mechanisms by which the security services in Russia are involved and implicated with their partners in that region. So you see the security services there deeply involved in influencing communications, but the other thing is during the Soviet era, all the countries most of the countries rather, within the Iron Curtain or behind the Iron Curtain, had what was called the SORM network deployed. So the SORM network is a lawful interception modification engine that historically applied to telephone communications and over time has been upgraded, unsurprisingly, to apply to internet and everything else. This system is used for particularly profound information control. And one of the difficulties with studying that network is gaining access to the routers is very challenging. And even when you do gain access to them, quite often you need to also have access to the command and control system within the Russian government. And so as an example, let's say you have a former Soviet country, the SORM network is still there, and the Russian government still has some degree of access to it.
My question was about Eastern Europe, which is now European Union, and nothing to do with Russia. I understand Russia has its own challenges of different nature. But the European Union countries that have been behind the curtain, nothing to do with the Soviet Union, but are they part of the European Union already in terms of surveillance and therefore fewer rights for individuals in that way to privacy, or are they?
Certainly as a requirement of being a member of the European Union there's a series of legal requirements that you have to agree to. Some of them include wiretapping and things of that nature, such that if a warrant is issued, pardon me, if a warrant is issued in Belgium and someone is tracking along former countries, then that interception has to continue. So there are efforts to ensure that the European security system applies to new members of the European Union as well.
Wow, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, there's a question right here.
So this question maybe is for you, Christopher, and both of you sort of jump in there, because it's a bit of a practical question I'm trying to ask you as a policy side and perhaps the sort of implementation side. So what you sort of suggest in your thesis of your talk, it's quite interesting and I generally support it. But in terms of the implementation of it, imagine Canada decides to adopt this, but we are living in a very heterogeneous world. I mean, you just sort of heard, and you even commented on Russia, for instance. So you cannot go to a fight, the old adage goes, sort of with a fist when the other person has a gun. So how you're kind of addressing that from a democratic perspective, and then also technologically perhaps there can be a solution that we can have our own values and systems that may need to be really tied closely to a very robust technological solution, quantum.
So practically, it's a hard challenge, and so it'd be easy to say, well, there's an easy solution, you do this, but we don't have it. So in the Canadian context, one of the strategies that we're adopting in partnership with colleagues and allies in the United States, efforts in the UK as well, is to try and through constitutional law or the equivalent thereof, to try and push back and say, because these agencies are targeting domestic citizens, those aspects of the programs have to be turned off. And it's sort of a way of trying to, if you cannot target Canadians, it actually means that the systems generally have to be disabled, because you will catch Canadians in the world. So it's one way of trying to curtail those activities, but it doesn't work well, and it's fragmentary. And so one of the efforts has to be to simply change the understanding of the extent to which human rights must be protected or respected. So one of the things that colleagues of mine are doing in New York right now, as well as other jurisdictions, is really trying to play to the fact that many of the countries that are involved in these kinds of intelligence operations are signatories to human rights. And so the very activities of the signals intelligence agencies contravene basic human rights protections. So I think that really has to be the angle right now. And one of the downsides with that, at least in my experience, is speaking about human rights in the United States, to a lesser extent in Canada, you don't get laughed out of the room in Canada, but that's sort of the step up from the US. So practically, it's a problem that we've been dealing with in a whole bunch of different fronts. And it's court challenges so far that seem to be the most hopeful, as legislators have been very slow to react. And in fact, there's a book that a colleague of mine, Simon Davies, collated 1 year after Snowden, and he went to every country where Snowden documents had been disclosed to say, what has actually changed in your countries? And in every country, the only thing that seemed to have any effect had been court challenges. Legislators generally had just declined to get engaged. In terms of, are there technical solutions to try and fight back? I should probably say sure, I guess. But the problem is, I think that this is a basic democratic problem. And so trying to respond principally through the lens of technology, it's only effective for a very small subset of the population that's technically skilled enough and has the time to engage in those activities, and they will mess up. At the Citizen Lab, we have a very high security infrastructure. We mess up on a daily basis, and we're supposed to be pretty good at this stuff. You give that to someone who it isn't top of mind all the time, and they will just mess up or not use it, because most security systems don't work well. The other difficulty is that even when you have a strong theoretical model for how you can secure a system, implementation is a gross problem. So I mentioned in my talk that the hardware security modules that really underlie our ability to be secure online. So when you generate the certificates for when you go to a secured website or something like that, you need a hardware security module to help generate strong cryptographic keys. Well, many of those modules are broken. And so we run into this problem of even if we have a strong quantum system, the implementation of that system is almost guaranteed to be garbage, or will be found to be garbage given enough billions of dollars to like find the vulnerabilities. So I think it has to be a democratic solution. Technology, I don't think it's the solution.
So maybe in the last 2 minutes and 30 seconds, Thomas, can you give us your 1 minute opinion on that question of the technological progress, whether we're going to have quantum things in our pockets?
Yeah, it's a very good point. The vulnerabilities, right? Even quantum systems could be vulnerable down the road. But I do want to make one advantage of quantum is that, for example, it was brought up a letter, right? If I would encode a letter in quantum information, send it from A to B, I would be able to tell if somebody looked at it, right? So at least there's those kind of new aspects which quantum information might offer into this when we're looking for a solution.
Okay, and maybe Cami, I don't know if you can comment on whether technology.
Get to your question, but it's kind of coming a little bit more onto the implementation component that's being brought up. I mean, this is coming up very heavily in the usable security field right now. That implementation is terrible, and it's the sort of question that actually comes across my desk fairly frequently at the moment. Can you come down to this place and teach our students not to screw this up? No, we don't even know how to teach that to students from an educational perspective or a psychology perspective. We're not really even sure how to get some of these concepts across, because I could teach you how to use that API properly, or I could go figure out how to put a better usable API on it. But it's so hard to teach a student how to threat model, how to take a look at a situation and think to myself, who might actually attack this? Because they stare at you and go, why would anyone do that? There's no reason. Like, why would you ever put a true into something that's intended for a number? It's a silly thing to do. And so we have an enormous implementation problem, and it's coming up very strongly, and it's a huge education problem, and it's a huge problem kind of coming out of the usable security in space and how to deal with that. Because if we can't trust the technologies that we're trying to actually build some of these other discussions upon, we have a big problem. And a lot of companies and governments and funding agencies seem to agree with that.